Well, hello and welcome back to Students at First Online. My name is Trevor Backoffner. I'm the Students and Families Pastor at First Christian Church, and we are in week 2 of our series, The Necessity of Lament. We've been working through the book of Lamentations in the Old Testament to uncover what it means for us to both lament our situation and circumstances, as well as to spiritually lamenting the sin that we have committed, and the kind of the gap between us and God and the standard that He set for us. So we are in chapters 2 and 4 this week. So as we go through it here, we'll just begin by hopping right into chapter 2, verses 1 through 8. Let's check it out. How the Lord has overshadowed daughter Zion with His anger. He has thrown down Israel's glory from heaven to earth. He did not acknowledge His footstool in the day of His anger. Without compassion, the Lord has swallowed up all the dwellings of Jacob. In His wrath He has demolished the fortified cities of daughter Judah. He brought them to the ground and defiled the kingdom and its leaders. He has cut off every horn of Israel in His burning anger and withdrawn His right hand in the presence of the enemy. He has blazed against Jacob like a flaming fire that consumes everything. He has strung His bow like an enemy. His right hand is positioned like an adversary. He has killed everyone who was the delight to the eye, pouring out His wrath like fire on the tent of daughter Zion. The Lord is like an enemy. He has swallowed up Israel. He has swallowed up all its palaces and destroyed its fortified cities. He has multiplied mourning and lamentation within daughter Judah. He has wrecked His temple, as if it were merely a shack in a field, destroying His place of meeting. The Lord has abolished appointed festivals and Sabbaths in Zion. He has despised king and priest in His fierce anger. The Lord has rejected His altar, repudiated His sanctuary. He has handed the walls of her palaces over to the enemy. They have raised a shout in the house of the Lord as on the day of an appointed festival. The Lord determined to destroy the wall of daughter Zion. He stretched out a measuring line and did not restrain Himself from destroying. He made the ramparts and walls grieve. Together they waste away. I really don't like this section. I really don't. Like, show of hands, who thought that was a fun section to read? This isn't the type of stuff that I want to open the Bible and read about God. I don't want to read about what God does in His anger. I don't want to see what God does to call Himself an enemy against His people. And not only has He withdrawn any help from them, He's also taken up arms against them. We see in these first 8 verses, God's reaction in anger to that of His people. And some form of the word anger is used in almost every verse of those first 8, just to get the point across. It's uncomfortable. It's difficult. But this shows us, on a grand scale, how big God's feelings are. And as we talked about briefly, last week, how seriously God takes the sin of His people. Any sacrifice that they offered was just spurned because God had declared Himself the adversary to Israel. His anger, which in some translations is described as a cloud, is also more often like that of a fire, is covering Israel. It's consuming everything, destroying everything. And I wanted to stop after reading these first 8 verses because we see very much how true the words of Dallas Willard are when he said this. He said, God isn't mean, but He is dangerous. What's scary about all of this isn't that, God does this, but that the people of God in their sinful nature actually deserved it. And chapter 4, verses 1 through 11 gives us a better picture of that. So let's turn there and read. How the gold has become tarnished, the fine gold become dull. The stones of the temple lie scattered at the head of every street. Zion's precious children, once worth their weight in pure gold, how they are regarded as clay jars, the work of a potter's hands. Even jackals offer their breasts to nurse their young, but my dear people have become cruel like ostriches in the wilderness. The nursing baby's tongue clings to the roof of his mouth from thirst. Infants beg for food, but no one gives them any. Those who used to eat delicacies are destitute in the streets. Those who were reared in purple garments huddle in trash heaps. The punishment of my dear people is greater than that of Sodom, which was overthrown in an instant without a hand laid on it. Her dignitaries were brighter than snow, whiter than milk. Their bodies were more ruddy than coral, their appearance like lapis lazuli. Now they appear darker than soot. They are not recognized in the streets. Their skin has shriveled in their bones and has become dry like wood. Those slain by the sword are better off than those slain by hunger, who waste away, pierced with pain because the fields lack produce. The hands of compassionate women have cooked their own children. They became their food during the destruction of my dear people. The Lord has exhausted his wrath, poured out his burning anger. He has ignited a fire in Zion, and it has consumed her foundations. Everything that the people of God had received, whether it was in the temple as a special gift, whether it was the gold, the bright jewels of the ephod for the high priest, or just the structure of what was once the temple where God's presence dwelled, is all gone. This shows in a real and symbolic sense the scattering of the people Israel spiritually. While they've been lamenting, certainly most of their time has been attempting to survive. Even the animals, it says, still nursed their young, but the people were so desperate in their misery that they ate their own children. This shows the decline of the people to a point of cruelty towards, they liken it to an ostrich. The ostriches are, they commonly leave their young out in the wilderness. They abandon their babies. And anyone who was of any importance or affluence or high status was now impoverished. They traded their bright garments for trash heaps. I remember in the book of Job, in his plight, he sat on a trash heap as well. Everything they were experiencing was the worst punishment that any sinful place had experienced. Even Sodom wasn't even this bad. Sodom didn't even get the luxury of a prophet in their walls, but Judea had. The people of Israel had, and that was one of the largest reasons that they were doled this additional portion of destruction. It shows us again just how much sin tears us apart. It tears apart families when left unchecked. It tears apart the self. And in looking at verse 10, it says, which speaks of these compassionate women who end up cooking their own children, it destroys us. And verses 2, in chapter 2, verses 9 through 16, give us some of that same picture. It says that everything was destroyed, and anyone that had any connection to God lost it. The prophets didn't have visions anymore. The city leaders just sat in silence. They had no words for this. They'd spent so much time in mourning that their lament had just turned to silent acceptance. And I'm guessing at some point in your life, you've experienced what the author speaks of in verse 11 of chapter 2, where the eyes are all worn out from weeping. If you haven't experienced what it's like to cry so much that you no longer have any tears to shed, that you physically can't, nothing's coming out, it's not a good place to be. And all that the prophet has left here is this inner churning. And I initially thought this was just like an inner turmoil. You're struggling to understand and to accept this. But the translation really, in the original language, points to this giant pit in the stomach that we sometimes get when we're definitely not in the right place, or things definitely aren't as they should be. It's this gut-wrenching pain that we feel as a result of the physical suffering that we are experiencing. And ultimately, the suffering they're experiencing has not been dealt out to anyone else. They're the only recipients. No one has received a punishment as dire as this one. And in addition to this injury, the insult was added because those who were their enemies, those who passed them by, just trashed them. They made fun of them. They scorned them. Yeah, you name it, they took the opportunity to rub it in the face of these people. And even in the second half of chapter 4, we see that this points to the unbelief of the people in two ways. No one in their wildest dreams would have imagined this happening to Israel. They were the chosen people. They were at the top of the food chain. They were the best, but because of the unbelief that they had, all of this stuff had taken place. They had been toppled from their high mountain. They were blinded and made unclean because of their unbelief. And we, at times, have somewhat of the same issue. The world around us, and sometimes the sinful practices that we have, cloud our vision. and pull us away from God. And we try to seek God, but it's hard to do when we can't see him. And this final section of chapter 2, verses 17 through 22, it gives this call from the prophet Jeremiah to the people of Jerusalem just to lament what they've done. So let's look at that and then we'll get into it. The Lord has done what he had planned. He has accomplished his decree which he ordained in days of old. He has demolished without compassion, letting the enemy gloat over you and exalting the horn of your adversaries. The hearts of the people cry out to the Lord. Wall of daughter Zion, let your tears run down like a river day and night. Give yourself no relief and your eyes no rest. Arise, cry out in the night from the first watch of the night. Pour out your heart like water before the Lord's presence. Lift up your hands to him for the lives of your children who are fainting from hunger at the head of every street. Lord, look and consider to whom you have done this. Should women eat their own children, the infants they have nurtured? Should priests and prophets be killed in the Lord's sanctuary? Both young and old are lying on the ground in the streets. My young women and young men have fallen by the sword. You have killed them in the day of your anger, slaughtering without compassion. You summon those who terrorize me on every side, as if for an appointed festival day. On the day of the Lord's anger, no one escaped or survived. My enemy has destroyed those I nurtured and reared. Jeremiah calls the people of God to cry out and ask for mercy. But even more than this, it's a reminder for the people that God has done exactly as he said he was going to do. Israel knew the law. They knew what it said, they knew what it required, they knew the covenant that they made with him, and they knew their nation's history. They knew the punishment that would behold itself if they did not honor their commitment to God. Yet they still found themselves cut off from God and punished in suffering. God is always going to do what he said he's going to do. He's always going to be true to himself. He's always going to uphold his standard, and the choices that we make, the things we do in alternative to worship of God, don't change God. He doesn't change. We can thank God for this because he also did what he said in sending Jesus. And while we'll look more in depth next week about the hope of restoration within the book of Lamentations, specifically chapter 3, it would behoove us to consider this for a second. God said that he would send his son, and he did. He said that he would take our sin, and he did. He said anyone who picked up the cross and followed him would gain life. Everything that God said he's going to do, he does. And yes, maybe you're like me in that you didn't like this chapter, that you don't like reading these sections of the Old Testament. I don't want to read these parts of the Bible because they're heartbreaking. They're difficult. They point out the inadequacies of humanity. But more than ever, we need to look at these. We can't turn a blind eye to our sin. We can't turn a blind eye to God's anger towards sin. We have to recognize God's sovereignty and his holiness in contrast to ourselves, because it's then that we are able to lament our sin properly. It's looking at ourselves and seeing what the author Dietrich Bonhoeffer talks about when he says, he talks about living a devout life with God. He says, the contrast between our behavior and the words of Jesus is all too painfully evident. That's where we leave the people of God at the end of chapters 2 and 4, and where we'll leave off today. But we have a hope. We have a hope of restoration that we'll look at next week. So let's keep looking to that hope. See you guys next week.